Today it looks like we've got some big answers for Warhammer 40k's Combat Patrol game mode. In this slightly weird new world of box set versus box set, how is it all going to work? Hello and welcome back to Warspets Tactics, where today we're talking about Warhammer 40k Combat Patrol, where GW have finally given us some proper details as to how the box set versus box set game mode works. Something that they told us the broad idea about so far, but hadn't really gone into any great depth. Now though, it looks like we know what we're getting for the faction rules, a bunch of datasheets, plus actually a surprising amount of rule support, stratagems and enhancements and things, a bit more of an idea as to the games and the mission rules that you might play with, plus a little bit about the Leviathan combat patrols, a fair few answers all in all I think. In case you've missed it up to now, Combat Patrol in Warhammer 40k 10th edition appears to be a very easy entry point for small 40k games. They did have their Combat Patrol mode in 9th edition, you definitely could play some fun small games there, but in general small games of 40k definitely have their issues. The game just doesn't become very balanced at that tiny points level, and I guess particularly not if people are free to spam whatever they want more or less. GW's new big idea for 10th edition is to literally play the box sets of Combat Patrol against each other. So say if you picked up Combat Patrol Genestealer Cults, you should be able to play that against Combat Patrol Orcs. And the aim is for the rule of this game mode that the box set should be at least somewhat balanced against each other, having to alter rules and abilities as opposed to points, as of course everyone's playing with the exact models that they get out of the box. They've mentioned in some teasers that some wargear rules will be simplified between alternative builds for certain miniatures. It might mean that we get a few datasheets that are kind of generic looking, regardless of the exact way that the miniature is modelled. We haven't seen full datasheets like that yet, but that's something they've mentioned in other previews. Realistically, despite any balance efforts they're making, I'd be kind of surprised if this winds up to be a particularly balanced game mode for 40k. Small games are just very swingy and kind of matchup dependent, but I feel like this system could definitely have some big improvements on the previous version. Probably having some sort of 100% balance isn't exactly the most important thing as well. This one's generally going to be played at a very casual level between friends I think, as opposed to anything super competitive. Let's take a look at the reveals in turn then, and first up they mentioned the Leviathan combat patrols, basically just saying that these two forces could be made out of the contents of the Leviathan box, and these could be fielded as combat patrol sets along with the rest. The Space Marine one, as we mentioned in the last video, does seem to be called Strike Force Octavius, a captain and a librarian in Terminator armour, 5 Terminators and 5 Infernus Marines, and the Leviathan side of things is the Winged Prime and that Psychophage, 5 Barbgorns, 3 Leapers and 20 Termagants. It looks like the idea behind these is that if you've got into 40k literally with the launch box, then you will be able to take part in games of Combat Patrol right away. You wouldn't be locked out of that game mode just because you happen to have not started with a Combat Patrol. Though I think it would have been quite nice if the article had actually confirmed whether or not these will be available to order separately, as at the moment it still doesn't look like it's confirmed. As I mentioned in the previous video talking about the Strike Force Octavius and whether that could be a Combat Patrol set, I was guessing that they'd have to update the Tyranid Combat Patrol, seeing as that one's got the older gaunts in. Seems kind of logical that they will update the Tyranid one at least. The Space Marine one does seem just a little bit model light. Obviously in terms of in-game power it's kind of fine, but literally one squad, one half a squad and 2 Space Marine characters would rank among the very smallest combat patrols, and I feel like if they sold it at their normal price then you wouldn't really get virtually any value saving. I guess it's possible that these things might be released as individual starter sets as opposed to just standard combat patrols. I guess we'll have to wait for the future for answers on that though. Going back to the actual Combat Patrol game mode though, and first up they've told us how the rules are going to be delivered. Most of this pretty much as expected, but again good to have confirmation here. They do confirm that the rule set will be using just the 10th edition core rules as a base. Almost all of these won't change from standard 40k, as I guess that makes sense so that if you're learning Combat Patrol, you're not just learning a completely different game that doesn't help you bridge the gap. Then on top of that, you'll have some Combat Patrol rules for how to play the missions and things. This will come in the 10th edition core books, the Leviathan one and the one that follows it, but apparently as with the core rules, Games Workshop will be making these free to download. Again makes complete sense if this is going to be an easy accessed game. Then in addition to that, we'll have the faction specific Combat Patrol rules, and these will be available to download too, but they won't actually be in the core book, as that will be reams and reams of datasheets and things, so I guess they're just going to be a digital download for each army. Then finally, apparently there will be a Combat Patrol rules section in future codexes. My guess would be that that might be where the datasheets and things are reprinted. So I suppose that would mean that you'd have the main datasheets in the codex, and then probably a subsection for the combat patrol rules, the datasheets, and the auxiliary rules there. As for how the actual game is played, the board size is 44 by 30 inches, basically 2 1/4 of a standard Strike Force game, or 2 Kill Team board tiles, so a bit of a smaller scale engagement than bigger games of 40k. A large part of the actual Combat Patrol rule set sounds like it's actually going to be devoted to the 6 missions that you can play on them. Like the previous version of Combat Patrol, these will be slightly tailored to be played with smaller forces, probably fewer objectives, and de-emphasizing anything that wouldn't scale down well to that kind of level. And unlike the mission cards, apparently these will be set missions. They have one mission twist type rule to make it a bit different, and specify the deployment zones, the objective map, and how the primary objectives are scored. Apparently for Combat Patrol, in this mode there'll be a slight difference compared with the main version of 40k, and that'll be that any battle line units can basically hold an objective and then get to move on, and they still get to hold that, basically sticky objectives. It means that if you had some troops for your faction, say maybe some Necron Immortals, they'd be able to plant the flag in a point, and it'd still be yours even if you move off it, unless your opponent takes it back. I guess that seems helpful enough when you've got so few units. Consigning any of them to just sit on home field objectives could be a bit annoying. Then I thought perhaps one of the most interesting things about this set is how many rules you get for the individual factions. I was honestly expecting something just to be very basic, just datasheets for the models perhaps, and you certainly do get those, and they have been slightly altered for power level and balancing purposes, but on top of that you get really quite a lot of other stuff. It almost seems like a mini version of a codex to get you used to some of the rules. They'll have the datasheets for the models involved, and as I mentioned earlier from one of their previews, it sounds like the different weapon options and things might just be consolidated into one set. Will be interesting to see how they handle that for things like Deathmarks versus Immortals, for example, or the Night Scythe versus the Doom Scythe. They then get their own faction-specific special rule, which again I'm sure some of them will be altered. I'd be surprised if the Space Marine Oath of Moment stays intact into the Combat Patrol game mode. You then get 3 stratagems to use, and I guess you'd still be able to access all of the core ones as well. Might make Combat Patrol really quite a command point heavy game, to be honest, if you're still getting the same amount as at a 2000 point game. Feels like you'd have a lot more command points relative to the amount of models on the board. Your Warlord can get an enhancement, and it looks like they have the choice between 2. And then interestingly enough, you also get a faction-specific secondary objective as well. Something I certainly wasn't expecting to see re-manifest itself here after it went from the main game. Again, it looks like you get the choice between 2 different objectives for your force to try and follow, in addition to the primary one. Apparently between all these levers and options, Games Workshop have tried to make them balanced. Some tweaks to datasheets as we mentioned, but they also would have quite a lot of scope for adding or removing power to the armies via things like the faction special rule or the stratagems that they have access to. GW have given us a fair few examples of the things that we can expect from these. First up, an example simplified datasheet from Captain Octavius versus the regular Space Marine Captain. That's quite an interesting datasheet in itself, to be honest, and I'll look forward to doing a video on that in the near future. Hopefully that should be one of the next on the channel. Just focusing on the differences though, Captain Octavius does get a few more simplified rules. Rather than the big flexible datasheet that it looks like the regular Captain gets, he's just locked to the war gear that you get in the Combat Patrol. He gives his squad re-roll charges, but it looks like he loses the ability to give them a stratagem for discounters. Looks like that could be one of the main Space Marine Captain buffs now. And interestingly enough for this one, it still looks like he retains Oath of Moment, maybe in a different form in his new Combat Patrol datasheet. The lack of change is kind of interesting on that, given that the Infernus Marines had a rule called Angels of Death written on them on one of their variant datasheets. Maybe that was just a completely different draft version of them, and Space Marines still might be getting an Oath of Moment version in Combat Patrol. I feel like it might have been a bit more helpful to see something with a bit more variant war gear and how they might handle that, but it certainly looks like this gives you the gist. Then beyond that, we've got a couple of examples of enhancements, secondary objectives and stratagems. Here are a couple of enhancements that you get the choice of to equip the Tyrannid Prime with in the Tyrannid Combat Patrol. I guess these might or might not represent ones that the Tyrannids actually get in their Invasion Swarm detachments. They could just be entirely unique to Combat Patrol. The way that they're phrased is that you get one of them as default, and then you've got the option to trade out for the second one if you prefer that. I guess that might be helpful for newer players and removing a bit of decision paralysis. If you don't want to think too hard about it, just go with the default. If you want to do a bit more army building and get used to enhancements and things, then weigh up the two and which one you prefer. The 2 options here are one called Psychostatic Veil, That one's a big defensive one with a 4+ invul, a -1 to hit in melee, and gaining lone operative so he can't be shot outside of 12 inches. Really quite a nice defensive package there to keep him safe. The other one is something called a Secretion Goad. This one's more of a buffing one that allows you to up the AP of a Tyranid attack within 6 inches. Looks like it could be used on himself, or could be used to affect a swarm of termagants, or maybe that Psychophage. A bit of extra AP certainly doesn't hurt against armoured targets. Just from the look of these, I kind of feel like the Veil thing might be a little bit stronger. I feel like the Tyranid Combat Patrol doesn't have the most awesome units that really want that buff, to be honest. I suppose it could be handy on the Barb Gaunts depending on their profile. Both of them do seem pretty usable though, and would add value. Next up, we've got an example faction-specific secondary. Again, I kind of was surprised to see these return, given that they went away for the main game of 40k. I guess in Combat Patrol it could be another mechanism for trying to balance the different armies, particularly if you only have the choice between 2 of them, and you're not weighing up against a whole bunch of book ones. For the ones that the Space Marines have access to, the default one is called Wrath of the Emperor. This one is a nice simple one for scoring 2 victory points in each phase that your captain kills an enemy model. I guess that's mainly going to be in melee, but if your opponent does have some Horde units, then the Stormbolter could come into its own and net you victory points there. I think out of the 2 though, I'd probably prefer the Shock Tactics one out of these. This one's one to control an objective that your opponent did at the start of the turn, and this one gives you 5 victory points. Out of the 2, this one just seems a little bit better to me. If you even manage to do this once per game, then your captain would have to kill things in 3 different phases over the course of a game to actually outweigh it, and I feel like it just fits in very well with what you generally want to do anyway in Warhammer 40k, fighting over objectives and taking ones that your opponent has. Seems the stronger of the 2, though again they both seem usable, particularly in the right matchup. Finally, we've got a couple of examples of previewed stratagems. These will be one of 3 of them for the Tyranids and the Space Marines. The Tyranid one is kind of a tones down one of the version that they get for mainline 40k, basically a 1 command point one to regenerate some Gaunts. Teaming Broods happens in your reinforcement phase, and you get to choose either replenishing D6 models into a unit, or choosing a slain unit that's now off the board, rolling 2d6 and getting that many Gaunts to come in via strategic reserve. Overall, this one just looks like a very powerful stratagem to me. Combat Patrol is going to be a game mode where you've got barely any units to start with. Just having an extra one turn up at the side of the board is enormously powerful for 1 CP, and you could potentially do this multiple times per game. Just having bodies to stand on objectives is really valuable, and I feel like this one will give the Tyranids a massive boost. I must admit, just looking at this one maybe doesn't give me enormous hope that this game mode is going to wind up completely balanced. If you manage to use that 3 or 4 times over the course of a game, you might expect something like 20 to 30 termagants to turn up. Just seems pretty enormously powerful on a Combat Patrol that's already got quite a lot of units in it. Lastly, for the rules previews, there's a Space Marine stratagem, this one called Veteran Instincts, and is maybe a bit more focused. This one allows one of your Terminator units to reroll wound rolls in melee against vehicles, or reroll ones to wound against other targets, and I kind of like the design idea behind this that they clarify in the article, basically saying that the Space Marine Combat Patrol doesn't really have much to deal with armoured targets that well. The new Power Fist profiles look like they're going to be wounding most vehicles on 5s, so this will give them at least one tool that they can use to take down vehicles at least a little bit easier. It maybe does seem like good game design, that one, as it might help with Combat Patrols being a bit less rock, paper, scissors if they try and make efforts so that each Combat Patrol will have the tools to deal with every other one. I'm sure there'll still wind up being some very bad matchups, but I guess some moves like this could help. Overall, despite a few criticisms, I do really quite like the previews that they've shown off so far for this. I feel like it's a pretty cool little contained 40k game mode. I think it's actually kind of a pleasant surprise that they are actually making the Combat Patrols into kind of mini codexes, having a few basic things but not quite the same complexity as having access to the entire army. I think I'd be quite optimistic that at a casual level this is going to be pretty good fun. Could allow you to get some multiple small games in with different factions, and could be an interesting way to just paint up one of these as a painting project and then have a quick way to use it in game if you want to. One question I do have at the moment though is whether or not they're going to be redoing Combat Patrols. If you paint up one of the current ones, how guaranteed is that to continue into the future, or are they just going to start replacing these with each codex that comes out? I feel like the vast majority of them stand up really quite well and wouldn't really need any sort of replacement anytime soon, though a few of them might. I really wouldn't be too surprised if the Tyranids one got updated due to their old Gaunts. That could be kind of rubbish for people who might have bought that. And I wouldn't be too surprised if maybe the Dark Angels one got redone if they do have a big plastic range release for them when their codex comes out. The current Primaris one doesn't really have all that much of a Dark Angels flavour. Still though, I guess they could still keep rules for these older box sets current. I guess we might not know that necessarily until Games Workshop actually start dropping the codexes and any releases that go alongside them. Let me know your thoughts on Combat Patrol though. Is it a game mode that you'd be tempted to try out, or are you going to be sticking to mainstream 40k where you can actually customise your army? If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, or I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description below. Channel patrons do get a few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.